The Horse Race is brought to you by Benchmark Strategies, Boston's leading public affairs and public relations consulting firm. To learn more, connect with Benchmark on LinkedIn at Benchmark Strategies or visit benchmark-strategies.com.
Welcome back to The Horse Race, your weekly look at politics, policy, and elections here in Massachusetts. I'm Jennifer Smith, reporter for Commonwealth Beacon, and it's Thursday, October 16th. Filling in with me as co-host while Steve rides on the back of a motorcycle on the East African coast is our erstwhile Western Mass correspondent and vice president of the MassINC Polling Group, Rich Parr. Hi, Rich.
Hi, Jen. Oh, and Steve, don't die. We need you back here eventually.
We're very concerned specifically about Steve's safety, as listeners might remember when he first said that he was in Kenya, and instead of Ubers or taxis, there was a good chance that he was just going to be on the back of a motorcycle, and I did careen into suburban mom core response, just being like, my child / podcast co-host can never be on the back of some strange man's motorcycle.
But I have seen the pictures, dear listeners, and this is in fact happening over there. So, I'm getting the travel log that we get through our work chat of Steve's adventures is really quite remarkable.
It's true. But, one thing that did not escape him is, so we're recording this on Wednesday the 15th, which is the day that here in #Mappily, we have gotten the announcement that Seth Moulton, a representative from the North Shore, of course, has transitioned from not thinking about running to not running to folks he's running. Rich, is that that's the political trajectory we've seen over the past few months?
Yeah, pretty much. He is officially running, and has out an ad. His announcement video has him point of view running, literally in the ad. He's running through looks like a cemetery, and then it ties into something he says about something that happened to him in Iraq. He's an Iraq war vet. But Jen, you and Steve, you talked about the polling on Markey's age being a liability for his reelection just last week. So my question to you is this announcement proof that Seth Moulton is a horse race listener?
Well, I mean, look, we have to assume that one of two things happened. Either Seth Moulton was waiting for that poll to go out and prime everybody, or, he was going to sit there in not running territory until we personally took a little poke at how people felt about Ed Markey's age. So, I think the self-aggrandizing answer is definitely, my man.
Yes, I think so. Or it might not have been a push poll, but it did push him into the race.
Oh, look at that. This is incredible. We got running puns. We got push-pull puns. I mean, Rich, what was your immediate response to the video from Seth Moulton, your former classmate?
Yes, that's right. I did not know Seth Moulton in college, but we were actually in the same year of college. So, class of 2001 represent. I will say I did watch the video. Interesting choices. It is shot in a POV style, some of which is him, I think, because he's making breakfast for his kids, I think it looks like at one point, and he's running, as I mentioned, through a cemetery. But there's also, then it shifts into like he's a lobster man. He's on, this the point of view of a person who's working on the water. There's a person who's a nurse working in healthcare. So I guess the message is that it's to Seth Moulton connecting with the working people of Massachusetts and kind of taking their perspective as why he's running. But I think the most interesting thing about the ad is, of course, why is he running, right? And what he says in the announcement ad. And I'll just read it. We're in crisis, and with everything we learned last election, I just don't believe Senator Markey should be running for another 6-year term at 80 years old. And then he goes on to say, even more, I don't think someone who's been in Congress for half a century is the right person to meet this moment and win the future. So our former colleague and friend Gin Dumchis, now writing for Masterless, points out that everything we learned last election sure sounds like a reference to Joe Biden and his struggles with age during the presidential campaign. So, that's interesting. But Jen, what do you think? What do you think of these two ideas of age, but also the amount of time spent in Washington as being almost disqualifying in this current moment, this political moment?
I did find those two dynamics really interesting, in part because they sort of served as the one major distinguishing characteristic that Seth Moulton was pointing to here. So in the ad itself and in remarks that Moulton has made since the announcement, the thing that's very interesting to me is that he's not eager to differentiate himself, at least on kind of the macro level, with Ed Markey's actual political policy. He says, Ed Markey is a good guy. He talks a lot about universal health care. He talks about climate resiliency. He talks about trains. So the language that he's using and kind of the visuals that he's bringing to the campaign ad are sort of, I think, an effort to say, well, we're not actually coming for Ed Markey on the substance. We're coming basically on the literal fact of his age and his presence in Washington. There's this idea that Democrats haven't done enough to push back against, as Seth Moulton describes them, the MAGA Republicans and Trump himself. So that's just very, very interesting to me because it does make me think about the last time that a young congressman from Massachusetts challenged Ed Markey and did make, I think, more veiled references to his age at the time was Joe Kennedy III. But that was many years ago at this point, and the language didn't really kind of take hold in the same way because there's something about saying you'd be starting your new term at 80 when we've just gone through an entire cycle with a lot of discussion about President Joe Biden's age that I think makes the issue feel a bit more important, a bit more immediate to the Seth Moulton pitch to take Ed Markey's seat. He also made specific reference, as we did last week, to Dianne Feinstein and other members of Congress who have either aged out or died in office, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I think Seth Moulton is banking on age being a really concerning trigger point for Democrats who are looking at who's representing them in Congress, and also kind of doing his best to reassure people that this isn't going to be, a right moderate campaign against the incumbent senator.
Yeah, I think that's right. That was my thought too, was like, haven't we already seen this before, ideologically speaking? Joe Kennedy III and Seth Moulton, I feel like, are more from the center of the Massachusetts Democratic Party, and Markey is pretty good left bona fides. I think the interesting thing, I think Seth Moulton is right to be talking about this gerontocracy problem within the Democratic Party, but it's not necessarily the case that the oldest members are, all of them, incapable of meeting this particular moment. You think of like a Bernie Sanders, for example. I think people think of him as one of the more active senators against Donald Trump. So I'm not quite sure if those two things, being not strong enough against Trump and being old, completely overlap. And Ed Markey might be the rare situation where voters say, yeah, he's old, but he is still fighting the good fight as we'd want him to right now. So I think that's going to be super interesting to look at and see how does that label land on Markey? What does he do to respond to that, and how does it kind of play out going forward?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head because, of course, that was Markey's campaign's immediate response there, which is essentially, Seth Moulton is complaining about things in Washington and trying to kind of replace leadership that has worked well. And so that is their pitch. Seth Moulton is saying, invest in a new generation of leaders here rather than kind of waiting for the older ones to die off, which is very similar from the way that Joe Kennedy III talked about it at the time. And Ed Markey is saying, if you've got a good thing, don't toss it out. So it'll be very, very interesting as we get more polling and as we get closer to the 2026 midterms here to see how that's resonating in Massachusetts, because, and correct me if I'm wrong, polling man, I don't think there's a real disconnect between, on the big issues, Ed Markey or Seth Moulton and the way that most voters in Massachusetts kind of feel about where they'd like their delegation to go. Yeah,
I think that's right. I mean, Moulton, I think, comes from a slightly more conservative district by Massachusetts terms, right? There's a little bit of Trumpiness going on in different parts of it, but it still went very solidly for Harris. It's not still very much a blue district. And it's true that, Democratic voters are not happy with Democrats in Congress. Like, their approval ratings are low right now. And a lot of that has to do with the reactions to Trump. But again, people can hate Congress, but they like their own representative, and we'll have to see whether that translates over into wanting to say goodbye to Ed Markey and usher in a new generation for the Senate next year.
All right. Well, there will be more to come on that. Again, we are recording this literally, I think, 4 hours after Seth Moulton made his announcement. So there will be more to come on the Ed Markey incumbency challenge. But for now, let's pivot over into a shocker to all, more polling. Rich, how's that sound?
That sounds great. I mean, that's why I'm here, right? We're going to talk a little bit about kind of a serious topic. We're going to talk about polling around political violence and how this is going to get a little wonky too, because we're going to talk a little bit about what that polling is showing, but also in what ways that polling might not be capturing the full picture of what we're seeing here.
That's right. And after you make it through that, stick around to find out if the President of the United States wants to take the World Cup away from Foxborough. So, shall we? So there's a topic that's been coming up more and more since both the shooting of Charlie Kirk on September 10th and the assassinations of Minnesota legislators on June 14th. And that is the broad brush of political violence. Of course, these are very extreme examples. These are assassinations here, but political violence can mean a lot of things. Since these events took place, the news, kind of in general, and then social media also, has focused more and more on stories about rising political violence in America and frequently citing polls on public opinion about rising alleged public support for these kinds of violent acts. So what we're talking about here is this 24% of self-described very liberals believe that it is acceptable to be happy about the death of a political opponent, and, quote, 26% of young liberals believe political violence is sometimes justified. That's what Vice President J.D. Vance said after the Charlie Kirk assassination, talking about the way that kind of the left and the liberals feel about, allegedly, political violence. So, Rich, I get to do to you what I always do to Steve and say, that sounds pretty bad. Where did those numbers come from?
Yeah, so those numbers that Vice President J.D. Vance was, I think, cherry picking, to be honest. When you actually read the full poll, you see that most people think that that is not okay. And most Democrats think that that's not okay. But if you drill down, the best that Vance could find was that very liberal, 24%, so a quarter of very liberal people think that it is acceptable. 26%, a quarter of young liberals believe that political violence is sometimes justified. So yeah, this is one of those things where even if it's a minority, we want to keep an eye on it because it could be a symptom of sort of a fraying of our political fabric here. And there is another poll that came out recently that NPR did, I believe, with Marist. Yes, NPR PBS News Marist poll, which asked a question last year and then is repeating it, asking people their agreements with this statement: Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. So in March of 2024, they found 20% of Americans agreed with that statement. In September of 2025, they found 30% of Americans agree with that statement, so a 10% increase on that. And what they really saw was that Democrats had shifted pretty dramatically in agreeing with that statement, from 12% of Democrats up to 28%. Republicans went from 28 to 31, which is, a pretty marginal difference, and then independents went from 18 to 25. So you're seeing Democrats and independents becoming more kind of okay with this idea that we might need to resort to violence. And the Republicans, who are currently in power, didn't decline. They actually went up a smidge. So very concerning in terms of the temperature of the room rising, and that people are maybe getting to a point where they think that there may be some situations where this is acceptable.
And one of the reasons that we wanted to talk about this today is that there was a very long, very interesting Substack post from G. Elliott Morris talking about how kind of the reception to these polls kind of overstepped or oversimplified by implying, I think pretty clearly that X number of people saying that political violence might at any point be warranted. And again, I am advocating for literally zero things here. I would note that defining political violence is kind of complicated. Our country was founded on a revolution here. One of the kind of major reasons for defending the Second Amendment from its proponents is the idea of like revolution against tyranny. So those would also fall under some category of political violence if you want to take kind of a historic lens to it. But the poll analysis from G. Elliott Morris here was saying the way that you define political violence tells you a lot more about how people are thinking about the probability of it, how they feel about it. And I think what I'd like to delve into basically immediately is like nobody thinks you should murder partisan opponents.
Yeah, that's right. I think so. So we're going to be cribbing a lot from a great article that, as you mentioned, that G. Elliott Morris wrote on his Strength in Numbers website. If you like politics and polling, you should read this and follow him. He's great. But basically, he's arguing, and it gets a little bit into the methodological weeds a bit, that how you word the question and how people take surveys can make a big difference in terms of whether we're looking at an accurate measure of how many people are okay with violence, and or whether we're looking at sort of an overstated number. And so first off, the idea of a hypothetical situation, as in that NPR Marist poll, where we're saying Americans may have to resort to violence in order to get the country back on track. There's a few steps of abstraction here away from it is okay to shoot somebody else that you don't agree with on politics, right? So if you were to ask that latter question, I think you would get a much lower level of agreement than something that is sort of as abstracted as that. That question sort of implies that there was some event that people are reacting to, right? You know, that there's like it's almost giving people a reason to resort to violence, right? Just the way that question is worded is almost kind of giving people some reasons to maybe say that this could be okay, right? So that's one thing. How the question is worded really matters. Another thing is that sometimes when people take surveys, this is getting a little in the weeds, but sometimes when people take surveys, they may not be paying as close attention to what they're doing as we would like them to. These are called inattentive respondents. People who are just going through the survey and checking yes to things without really fully paying attention. And in this article, G. Elliott Morris finds a study where essentially if you do some things in your survey to weed out these inattentive people and then ask them some questions about some bad behaviors around politics, what you find is that the acceptance of those bad things, like sending somebody a threatening message over politics or harassing them online, or whether or not January 6th is justified or not, the percentage of people who agreed or said yes to those statements drops very dramatically when you weed out kind of those folks who are maybe not paying as close attention as they should be when they're taking the survey. So that has bigger implications for all kinds of surveys. But in this particular context, what he's saying is essentially, if you really are doing good survey research and really kind of drilling down on the methods, it looks like the level of acceptance for violence is lower than some of these more recent polls would suggest that it actually is.
And then, of course, when the answers are a little bit more varied, for instance, than just yes or no, you saw greater variation as well. We talk sometimes about the idea of kind of strong opinions loosely held or weak opinions strongly held, and how hard it is to get at that sort of stuff with polling. So it seems to me, and so check me on this, that the way that you phrase a question that is most likely to get the highest number of people saying, oh, sure, yes, is to phrase it broadly, invite hypotheticals, don't scan for people who are only kind of gently paying attention to the substance of the poll, and then don't clarify what the circumstances or what the level of violence is. Like, that is the way you would write a question that would get a quarter of liberals or a quarter of young people or something like that to be most likely to just answer yes, right?
Exactly. Right. So in the case of that NPR Marist poll, I mean, it's pretty broad. Resort to violence. What does that mean? Does that mean a direct sort of person-on-person violence? Does it mean like, there's a whole host of ways that could be interpreted in order to get the country back on track. Well, that's pretty vague too, but it's also kind of giving a pretext here. So yeah, that is a pretty broad question, and as a result, you're seeing these kind of numbers. Now, I will say, I mean, it is kind of an alarming shift over the course of a year and a half that they're tracking here. But there are some reasons to believe that maybe if you were to ask this in a little bit more direct way, that you would get a lower level of agreement with that particular statement.
Right. And kind of to the point I alluded to earlier is other polling and research that G. Elliott Morris was looking at noted that if you're adding kind of these clear definitions, you get something more like 9% for threats, 8% for harassment, 6% for nonviolent felonies, and 4% for violent felonies or using violence if the other party wins an election. Like, so if you're asking, what is the appropriate response to a political outcome, very, very, very small numbers of people are saying that violence of a very intense nature would be appropriate. Now, all of this is to say, a very small number of people can do a great amount of harm, of course. You don't need 25% of people to decide to try and assassinate a political opponent. So it is identifying that there is still a feeling there. But I guess I'm curious, as you're thinking about polling and the utility of polling, what is the useful metric that you would be looking for here? Is it kind of gauging a sentiment of hostility that might indicate that there could be something like January 6th that erupts? Or is it looking for kind of very discrete instances of, interest in an intense violent response?
Yeah, and I think, and I want to say I'm sympathetic also, because we've been kind of picking apart the NPR Narist number here and question the way they asked it. The thing that we're comparing it to was a pretty sophisticated experiment, which is breaking out different types of violence in different ways and asking it in different manners. When you're doing a media poll, you may have an opportunity to ask one or two questions on one topic and then move on to the next thing. So it's not possible to get into quite the level of detail and all of the different scenarios that these researchers were using in order to kind of sort out really what is the true level here. That said, I think there are some lessons to be taken, which is to say, be specific, really kind of, don't try to, if you're keeping it vague, you're going to get more people to agree with a certain statement. That's something that I think all researchers can kind of keep in mind with when they're dealing with a sensitive topic like this. But in terms of other things that we'd be looking for in terms of like the state of the civic politics, I mean, there have been research questions asking about, personal feelings towards people who disagree with you in politics. Like, is it just that you disagree on politics, or do you actually think that disagreement makes that person, less morally good than you, or something like that? Or would you consent to a member of your family marrying someone from the other political party? Like, these are questions that have been used over the years to sort of track the level of polarization, the level of divide that we're seeing in the country. And we are a pretty divided country. There's less agreement, there's less overlap between the parties in terms of their positions on issues, and there's less common ground between them in general. So those are all challenges, but that does not necessarily lead directly to straight line to someone is going to do something violent against somebody else.
That's right. And I think the last thing to kind of put a button on this is a YouGov poll that you noted that Democrats and Republicans are both more likely to say that political violence is a big problem right after an attack on members of their own parties. So, you can go back to after Paul Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's husband, was attacked in his home. 53% of Democrats said that political violence was a big problem after that, and just 31% of Republicans. And then that goes up. The Republicans actually leapfrog Democrats after the assassination attempts on Donald Trump. Democrats were more likely to say it after the assassination attempt on Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, and you see similar patterns after the Minnesota assassination and Charlie Kirk's assassination. So it's not just that we've got polarization kind of writ large, but specifically partisan responses to political violence that we should probably be aware of.
Yeah, I think the most disturbing thing about this chart that you're talking about is that there's been so many recent episodes of political violence that YouGov was able to put together a chart like this where 5 of the 6 things they're talking about have all happened since 2024. I mean, it's really sad. And that alone is, I think, a sign that we're in dangerous territory here, regardless of whatever specific poll number shows support among certain groups or not. Just the fact that we have enough of these instances that we have to keep asking these questions in polls is not a good thing.
I'm Zainab Asma-Doyle, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. The MassINC Polling Group serves the region's leading foundations, political groups, government entities, and businesses. Our surveys and focus groups bring high-quality data to the toughest questions facing society today. Learn more at massincpolling.com.
And that brings us to our final segment, which this week is brought to you by our Department of International Sporting Events that may or may not be in the Bay State in the near future. And we're referring, of course, to the World Cup, which is going to be held across the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 2026. And some of the games are supposed to be happening, they say in Boston, but it's actually going to be in Foxborough. And someone perhaps should tell President Trump that yesterday, because yesterday he was asked by a reporter whether he would consider taking the World Cup games away from Boston, and he said yes, because he does not like the Boston mayor Michelle Wu. And of course, as you know, Foxborough and Boston are some distance away from one another. Foxborough does not even have a mayor, has a select board. So I'm not sure if anybody on the select board of Foxborough has offended Donald Trump, but They seem to be being judged for the alleged sins of another political leader in another city in Massachusetts. Anyways, Jen, do you have any thoughts on political leaders threatening to move sporting events from one place or the other? You're from Utah, which of course Mitt Romney in the Olympics.
Yeah, literally just Mitt Romney throws himself bodily on top of the 2034 Salt Lake Olympics and says, leave it alone. I think one thing that stood out to me here is that this is a very similar sort of thing that the president has said before. So it's sort of kind of like implying that something might happen. He said, we could take them away if somebody is doing a bad job, if I feel there's unsafe conditions. He said he would call the head of FIFA and say, let's move it to another location. So, the games in Boston and the Boston area are in fact already sold out in 2026. And so it's kind of an odd thing to say in general because of that. And then the response from Boston Mayor Michelle Wu was basically pretty dismissive of this suggestion. The president also oddly made a remark about Michelle Wu, saying that she's not good, there are worse than her, at least she's intelligent. She's intelligent, but she's radical left. So there's a lot going on here, Yeah, read into that what you will. Those remarks about that, I would made a note of that as well. Trump then went on to say that the same could apply to the Olympics, that he could call up the Olympic Committee and say, we'll just not do it in Los Angeles. And I think the great irony of this would be if Donald Trump took the World Cup away from Boston, but then gave us back the Olympics because he wanted to take it away from Gavin Newsom in California. So we'll see, I guess. Maybe we'll have multiple sporting events here. Maybe we'll have none at all. Just a fascinating game of whatever the sports version of Risk is. The president just there kind of moving a soccer ball to and fro on a big old map. But that is all the time we have for today. I am Jennifer Smith, signing off with the delightful Rich Parr. Our production and theme music is done by Charlie Cazella. You can write to us at thehorseracepodcast@gmail.com. Don't forget to give The Horse Race a review wherever you're hearing us now. Subscribe to Commonwealth Beacon's daily download and reach out to the MassINC Polling Group if you need any polls or focus groups done. Thank you all for listening. We'll see you next week.